She walked onto the gravel drive like someone coming home, and the crowd made a small, collective calculation the moment they saw her. The silver cuff on Victoria Bradford's wrist tightened around a glass of champagne. A napkin paused halfway to a pale mouth. Conversations folded and diverted. Guests shifted away from the path Angela Washington chose, as if proximity itself might soil the polished linen and crystal beneath them. They avoided her. Not out of courtesy, not out of ignorance. It was a practiced social recoil, an instinct honed by generations of upscale gatherings where boundaries were clearly marked. Invitations, surnames, and a certain kind of smooth, polite exclusion. The driveway was lined with azaleas and a low stone wall engraved with the family crest. Beneath one oak tree, a brass plate, stamped with the Bradford's name, caught the sunlight and sent a small, arrogant glare to anyone who passed. Angela paused for a moment at that plate, fingertips resting on warm brass, as if reading a line of a long-remembered poem. She wore a simple dress, a navy blue that let her eyes hold their own. Nothing about her announced triumph or complaint. People expected either feigned humility or theatrical outrage, and when they found neither, their discomfort grew. It was easier to move away. It was easier for Victoria to point. "Security," Victoria said, small and sharp as the sound of a napkin being snapped. Her voice cut through the murmurs like a well-aimed pin. The word landed with practiced precision, authority as ritual, not as argument. Angela did not flinch. She turned to face Victoria with the same calm that had lived behind her eyes since childhood. There was no tremor, no plea, only a steady, even gaze that measured everything in the room and chose a truth to hold by. "You don't belong here," Victoria said, loud enough so that nearby guests angled to hear the spectacle. The sentence carried centuries of entitlement, like a perfume. "He's my cousin," Victoria added quickly, as if naming familial ties might seal the verdict in the air. "This is our property." A hush of approval rippled through the cluster of guests who had learned early that certain alliances demanded reflexive loyalty. The butler's jaw tightened. Plates were straightened as though to shore up the veneer of a perfect day. Someone whispered to the photographer to stop taking pictures. The camera lens blinked and turned away. Angela set her small handbag on the edge of the path and reached for the oak's rough bark, as if to steady herself on more than 2 feet of ground. The wood had memory. Her fingers brushed the old grooves, and for a moment she drifted away, not into anger, but into a landscape of recollection where voices were kinder and the work had been honest. There was a man on the far side of the lawn who did not look away. Thomas's hands were stained with years of soil and diesel. His posture carried the bow of someone who had learned dignity in small, steady labors. He had worked the estate in different hands for as long as anyone could remember. He straightened at the sight of Angela and spoke before he measured his caution. "Miss Washington," he called, his voice low but carrying across the trimmed lawn. It was careful, the kind of recognition that hoped to be private but knew it could not always stay so. The name spread like a small crack through the porcelain domes of the gathering. Eyes darted. A child dropped a bouquet. Conversation frayed at the edges. For those who had rehearsed their avoidance, the first audible acknowledgement was a problem. It demanded reinterpretation. Victoria's smile thinned. "Excuse me," she said, and it was as if the words had been engineered to erase Thomas's declaration. She stepped forward, the gilded watch on her wrist catching the sun and refracting it into tiny alarms. A young security man approached Angela with the scripted kindness of compulsory etiquette. "Ma'am, we can't have you here," he said, voice modulated to be firm without charity. "You'll have to leave." Angela's reply was quiet, precise. "I'm here to see Michael." There was a name on her tongue, Michael Bradford, the groom, happy in a tux 20 yards away, laughing with his best men. The word didn't carry accusation, it simply placed an intention. She had come for him. For a beat, no one moved. The air felt dense, the way it does just before a storm makes itself known. Then, in a ripple initiated by Victoria's eyes and maintained by social reflex, the cluster of guests stepped aside. They made room for the security man to escort Angela, as if making a polite perimeter would solve whatever discomfort her presence suggested. Detective Ray Coleman stood at the fringe of the gathering because protocol and curiosity had placed him there. He was not in uniform. His suit was tailored but unshowy, and his presence had been accepted as that of a family friend and an unremarkable kind of safeguard. He had seen anger contain itself, and he had seen calm contain something else. He watched Angela for reasons that had nothing to do with the gossip at hand. There was the shape of a story in her posture. As the security man spoke to Angela, she allowed herself to be guided off the main lawn. She walked with the ease of someone unused to being hurried. Thomas followed, keeping a careful distance to avoid trouble while not wanting to be rude. The butler, who had been thinly smiling at the spectacle, now curried discomfort into a stare that said he had been asked to do the wrong thing and had complied. Someone insisted the photographer delete his shots. The photographer's hands hovered over his screen. His thumb trembled as it hovered over the delete icon, and then moved away. He had grown up in a world where images were power. The instinct to erase was an attempt to preserve a certain version of the family narrative. He forced himself to keep the files. The path took them by flower beds perfumed with early roses. A pair of bridesmaids adjusted their gowns as if to smooth an injustice that had nothing to do with them. A harpist struck a hesitant chord. The wedding continued in miniature around this eddy of accusation, a performance that required each player to be small and impeccably appropriate. Angela was escorted to the stone patio at the side of the house, where a low table had been set with water glasses and a bowl of mints. The security detail explained dutifully that they had been notified of a trespass. Angela listened and then, with a single tilt of her head, indicated she would wait until Michael was free. "You can't," Victoria began again, but this time her voice had the thinness of someone repeating a script. "You can't expect me to explain," Angela said, but it was not a challenge she threw like a gauntlet. It was an offer of clarity, like setting down a fact upon which the room could either choose to act or to ignore. By then, a small crowd had gathered beyond the rope line. Guests peered from under parasols, and a few, emboldened by the safety of distance, whispered gossip into the air. Their voices were pink and delicate and cruel all at once. "You should go," a woman in a pink dress said, breath scented with heavy perfume. "There are children around." Angela smiled, not unkindly. "There are a lot of children here," she replied. "I understand." The exchange could have been the entire play in miniature, a woman standing her ground and an elite class practicing its small cruelties. But Angela chose another rhythm. She remained seated for a while on the woven chair, letting the sun and the gathered sound wash over her. She placed her hand inside her bag, and when she pulled it out, the movement was quiet and practiced. It was a black briefcase, worn at the edges in a way that suggested frequent use. People watching registered the color, black, like a punctuation mark. The bride's cousin gasped. Victoria's eyes narrowed to slits. The security man's hand clenched slightly at his side. There are objects that carry weight apart from metal and leather. This one did. It hinted at paperwork, at the kind of authority that is measured in signatures, not voices. Angela set the briefcase on the low table and unlatched it. Not a show, not a display. It was a small, deliberate opening. Inside, neatly arranged in stacks and folders, lay documents, deeds with embossed seals, surveys with ink-dark lines, tax receipts stamped and folded. Someone muttered the word deed like a talisman to be invoked. The photographer, who had been hovering on reflex, whispered to himself and swallowed. Detective Ray moved at that moment. He did not step forward as if ready to take command. He moved like a man who needed to verify what his eyes were telling him. "May I?" he asked, and when Angela inclined her head, he took out his phone and began, almost reflexively, to run a public records search. County records are blunt instruments of fact, the dry, precise catalogue of who owns land, who paid taxes, what history sits in public files. Ray scrolled, his thumb a steady metronome, and the screen warmly reflected in his pupils. He was looking for names, table headings, dates. He had learned to read the small fonts that tell larger truths. On the patio, voices rose and lowered like a tide. Victoria summoned her lawyer from a white-tiled terrace, and he came, briefcase of his own, face smoothed into professional concern. "This is a disturbance," he announced, because lawyers announce. It is their way of breathing meaning into situations. Angela slid a survey across the table without pronouncing the terms. The paper was familiar, creased along the usual fold marks. Its lines traced a shape everyone assumed belonged to the Bradfords. It had been, as far as the guests knew, their land for generations. The brass nameplate under the oak had declared as much. Thomas leaned close and read, and for all his rough hands, his voice when he said the words came out small and precise. "This shows the Washington boundary," he murmured. He did not shout. He could not. He knew what it meant to speak facts in a room of people who preferred myth. A hush began to creep into the edges of the gathering. The butler's shoulders went slack. A man who had been holding a glass of rosé set it down with its ring etched into the wood. People checked their phones as if to see what the outside world might say about this tethered moment. "You can't do this," Victoria insisted. Her voice sharpened into a different key. She gestured for someone to call the police, as if institutional sanction would solve the discomfort she felt at the undermining of a family story. Ray lifted his eyes from the phone for a second and met Victoria's gaze. He had been a cop long enough to know when a scene wanted to be smoothed over by loud voices. He also knew when documents spoke more plainly than alarmed assertions. "I'll look at the records," he said simply. The words were unobtrusive, but the motion of his fingers, tapping through the county website, was deliberate. He found a chain of title that did not end where the Bradford family portrait on the mantel would have suggested. Names of trusts, a sequence of transfers, and, crucially, a set of tax payments made through an entity with the name Washington in it. These were public facts, preserved by clerks and microfilm and the obstinacy of municipal systems. The discovery did not explode outward with thunder. It moved like a fault line shifting. Conversations clipped off mid-word. People leaned in, the way diners strained toward a whispered secret. The photographer, whose buttoned fingers had hovered over deletion, stopped breathing. "Interesting," Ray said, the word neither celebratory nor accusatory. It was the dry acknowledgement of a professional who had found something that demanded more attention. The phone screen glowed between his hands. On it, there were scanned images of old deed books, signatures looping in cursive that belonged to a different era. Angela had the papers on the table. Ray's phone confirmed more. An older map that named the Washington boundary, a ledger showing property tax credited to a Washington trust. Victoria's face registered the first genuine fracture. There is a particular motion, an involuntary reconfiguration of a smile into concern that crosses the faces of those who have spent lives buying certainty. She called Richard Peaton, her family attorney, and the man arrived with practiced composure that did not quite mask his consternation. He sampled the papers as if tasting them, and tried to impose a legal vocabulary onto the visible facts. Ownership is a matter of record. There are ways to clarify. His tone was the tone of one accustomed to smoothing legal wrinkles before they became headlines. Angela watched the exchange with a stillness that made it impossible to read anger into her face. If anything, there was the weathered patience in it of someone who had known long, slow injustices and understood that facts, once laid, have their own stubborn logic. When Thomas spoke, he told a small, terrible history. He was careful with his words, because to speak in an atmosphere of shame requires a different kind of courage. "My father worked this land," he said, "before they put up the stone, before the Bradford name." His voice thickened. He paused, then continued in a steadier melody. "I saw papers. I saw men sign things I didn't understand. They paid us low wages. My family kept working. We kept tending the hedges. We thought maybe one day someone would see." A woman near the back let out a sound that half formed into apology and then returned to gossip. Faces often looked to the next person for permission to feel. The permission was slow in coming. Angela opened one of the deeds and pointed to a corner stamp. The seal was small but distinct. It bore the name of a county clerk and a date. "This shows an attempted transfer," she said, voice steady, "but there are irregularities." She did not accuse with heat. She used the language of fact. Attempted transfer, irregularities, signed affidavits. There were names that, when paired with other documents, suggested a pattern. Documents filed in haste, a survey modified, an old crest removed and replaced by a new brass plate. These were things you could prove slowly by following the ink. Across the lawn, a man who had been laughing with the groom stopped mid-gesture and stared. He had been hired as part of the ceremony's decor and had no speech ready for legal irregularities. He watched the interplay of papers and social posture with the interest someone has in a new, sharp form of theatre. "So what?" he began, and then stopped because no one had an answer that fit the table dress and the floral arrangements. Ray scrolled through a ledger that showed tax payments made under a trust name. It did not immediately shout wrongdoing, it whispered history. The pattern suggested that, at some point, the land's financial documentation had been rerouted. Whether intentionally fraudulent or the product of the Valley of Grey that sometimes opens between intention and paperwork, was not something a single scroll of a phone could resolve. But it was enough to stop a wedding party in its tracks. "This is public record," Ray said, when someone looked at him as if he were the arbiter of truth. "County deeds are public." Victoria's lip curled. "Public record can be messy," she offered, trying for magnanimity and landing somewhere near petulance. She waved a hand, as if to throw the matter back into a comfortable realm where lawyers and time could smooth the edges. Angela did not rise to argue. Instead, she reached into the briefcase again and withdrew tax receipts folded with care. "These are payments my family's trust made for that property," she said. "They kept the books. They paid the bills. If you want to argue about a brass plate, we can, but the records tell a different story." Her voice was not triumphant. It merely described what the documents showed. A child tripped on the grass and burst into tears. Someone offered a tissue with the anxiousness of people who want to restore calm but are secretly grateful for the interruption. Michael, the groom, noticed the tension and made his way toward the edge of the crowd. He was a broad-shouldered man with a good laugh and a nervous hand habit. He rubbed his knuckle along his thumb when he concentrated. He had no idea his afternoon would become a ledger lesson. Ray's screen filled with scanned lines of names and dates. He tapped one entry and enlarged it. There it was, a string of transfers that painted years of occupation in a way that contradicted the family narrative on the brass plate. It suggested not just an accidental oversight, but a pattern of claims that had effectively erased another family's official presence. "You're sure?" Victoria demanded, the words more pleading than accusatory. Having your history challenged in public is always a brittle moment for the proud. Ray's silence answered the question in full measure. He was the sort of professional who understood that silence can be a more exacting verdict than words. He closed his phone and kept it flat on his palm as though holding a fragile small thing. The crowd's mood turned in small facets. Some faces hardened into defensive denial, others tilted toward curiosity, their brows knitting as they reinterpreted the afternoon. The butler's hands were folded and white-knuckled. Thomas stood with his chin lifted, as if honor had been unexpectedly returned. A few guests drifted away in small groups to reassemble in the shade and whisper. The photographer lowered his camera but did not delete the files. Angela's father came to her mind like someone stepping into a remembered light. He had been a man who believed in paper and in work. When he had explained the difference between ownership on a deed and ownership in the way people treat you, his voice had been patient and not bitter. He taught her to keep records and to note the world as it is, not as it is feared. She had kept his lesson like a compass. That past tense memory steadied her more than any public applause could. From her briefcase, she produced an old survey with a corner note in a handwriting that looked very much like Thomas's father's script. The paper smelled faintly of dust and the kind of patience that belongs to attics and deeds. She tapped the corner and said, "This shows the original boundary markers. My family lived here, we worked here, we paid our dues." A ripple of discomfort moved through the guests. To confront your social cosseting with slow, unassuming truth is a peculiar kind of affront. The kind that asks you to admit you may have been wrong in the ordinary, everyday ways that shape life. Richard Peaton, the family attorney, tried to reframe the issue into a legal limelight. "We can take this up in court," he declared, an old lawyerly attempt to invoke process as a protective fog. "We can look into every page. We have resources." He said it in the plural like a shield. Angela folded the survey back into the briefcase, as if closing a book that had been read aloud. "I am not here to make a scene," she said. The sentence was short, so no one could inflate it. "I came because Michael asked me to. But if you want to resolve a story, the county clerk's office can show you what's been filed. It's public." At this, someone near the hedge laughed in a small, uneasy way. It was a laugh used to deflect the feeling of being caught off guard. Others did not laugh. The laughter held a splinter of awareness. Some among them had taken ownership narratives for granted. Detective Ray's fingers hesitated over a thumbnail scan. His screen had a row of entries, older deeds turning into newer ones, signatures that did not line up in tone or timing. He zoomed in on a document stamp and frowned. "This payment history," he said, voice low, "shows regular tax payments under Washington Trust up until a transfer that looks opaque." "Opaque?" Victoria repeated, the word like a finger strokes on a paper cut. She was moving through stages of denial, each one smaller than the last. Before the web of documentation could widen into public argument, a commotion rose from the back of the garden where a bridesmaid had recognized a name. The murmurs multiplied into chatter. A woman in a silk dress clutched a program and squinted at the names printed inside. Someone whispered, and the whisper was immediately amplified by half the guests pulling out phones, checking social media posts, exchanging small fragments of the story. It was the sort of moment social gatherings live for. A crack that lets daylight in. For some, it was the dangerous excitement of a mystery unfolding. For others, it was the threat of scandal. For the Bradfords, it was the possible dissolving of a carefully curated family myth. Ray looked up, phone still in hand. Around him, the quiet had become charged. He met Angela's gaze for a heartbeat, and then, with the low calibration of someone who had seen lives tilt on small legal facts, said, almost to himself, "This isn't straightforward." At those words, the mood swung like a pendulum. The butler, as if remembering duties deeper than discretion, stepped in to insist they all maintain decorum. "Gentlemen, ladies," he intoned, the words landing lamely against the fabric of shock, "the ceremony is scheduled." But for a growing number of people on that lawn, the ceremony had already altered. The brass plate under the oak, once a simple emblem of status, now glinted like a contested artifact. Thomas's recognition had placed Angela into the center of a historical seam that had long been patched over. Ray's county record search had found a track that could not be ignored. A hush settled again, Not the rushed hush of forced propriety, but the weighty hush of expectation. People who had been certain of their place now listened for something that might change the narrative of the day. Angela closed her briefcase slowly, her hands steady. She looked at Victoria without malice. "If you want this resolved properly," she said, "it will be through the records, not through gossip." Victoria's face, which had been a mask of offended authority, finally showed a crack of genuine fear. That fear did not yet articulate itself into an offer. It simply sat like a sudden cold. Ray tapped his phone once more. He scrolled to a scanned page, enlarged a name, and then sharply locked the screen. He looked up at the crowd and said, in a voice that managed to be professional and human at once, "You should see this." Gasps rippled outward. A few in the back pulled out their phones, more to record the moment than to help. Michael paused mid-step toward the patio, his expression changing without fully understanding how. At the edge of the lawn, a child's balloon escaped and sailed up into the blue, a small bright orb that ignored the human calculus below. The guests watched it for a second, as if it were a metaphor they had not asked for. Angela stood and smoothed her dress. She folded the briefcase under her arm, with the quiet care of a librarian, not a victor. She looked at the people who had arranged themselves into judge and jury that afternoon, and in the briefest tilt of her chin showed nothing but a restraint she had learned in long, quiet rehearsal. "Let the record speak," she said, and the words fell like a directive, not a threat. They invited the audience to choose whether they would accept the clarity of public documentation or retreat to comfortable fictions. Victoria called to her lawyer again. Richard Peaton moved to the phone as if it were a lifeline. The guests muttered into their sleeves. The butler tried to arrange a polite buffer, and Thomas stood with his hands clasped behind his back like a man who had been asked to testify at a trial for the truth. Ray's thumb paused above a document image, then tapped to enlarge an entry that had names older than the house's stone. When he spoke, the word he used was measured and plain. "This traces back further than the Bradfords' claim." And for the first time that afternoon, the crowd seemed to imagine what tracing those lines might mean. The brass plate raised from the oak with a screwdriver, the crest replaced in a narrative that required no witnesses but itself, public acts re-examined in the light of public records. Someone whispered the word fraud, like a candle shown toward a dark corner. The word did not resonate with certainty. It was more a tremor of possibility. No hand was yet on the phone calling in charges. No cuffs were in sight. The law is slow, and the law is methodical, but there was a visible softening in the lines of command that had seemed so immovable in the morning light. Michael finally reached the patio, his face open and unsure. He had not formed a judgment. He only knew the person who had asked him to come to the wedding table and had been turned away. He had joked earlier that he wanted everyone who mattered there. He had meant friends and family, but had not considered the full shape of what mattered could include. His gaze landed on Angela. For a moment, the air between them held the kind of tension words sometimes failed to carry. He moved closer, not to take sides, but to seek clarity. He had not been following the documents. He had been busy smiling at his best man, thinking of dances and iced cake. But now there was a gravity to the moment that demanded his attention. Ray kept the phone flat in his hand, like an artifact that could be touched but not yet used as a weapon. People around them leaned forward, and the hummingbird buzz of small conversation slowed to a suspended breath. The day's carefully arranged order trembled on a hinge no one had expected. Outside the cluster, guests who had previously avoided Angela felt the pull of curiosity and conscience. Some relocated with stiff politeness, shame and curiosity braided into their conversation. Others stood rooted, choosing silence as their shield. Angela folded her hands and waited as if she had been standing in that pause her entire life. The briefcase, the papers, the oak with its brass nameplate, these were not props in her mind, but anchors. She had come to ask for simple recognition, not for a spectacle. She had come because a name had been called and a promise made. "You should see this," Ray said again, and in the simple instruction there was the inevitable invitation to follow the documents, to let recorded fact shape what they would now call truth. The lawn leaned in to listen. The lawn leaned in to listen. If you like stories that flip the script and leave you thinking, stay with this one. There's a moment coming that everyone will remember. A hush settled like linen over the guests as Richard Peaton, the family's attorney, curved his mouth into a professional smile that did not meet his eyes. He had the practiced air of someone who matched words to danger and could, with enough time and money, smooth almost any wrinkle. Today, the wrinkle had a name stamped on it, and the smoothing would not be instantaneous. Victoria's hand trembled a fraction as she accepted the phone from Richard. She spoke quickly, the words clipped and brittle with a woman's instinct to contain what she could not yet fix. Behind her, a cluster of friends formed, a small private staff of social armor, collars straightened, smiles frozen. They kept the illusion between themselves. Angela watched them with a calm that had nothing theatrical in it. She had not come to perform. She had come because an invitation had mentioned Michael's name, and because the story of a place, its actual history, had been misread and misfiled for a long time. She closed her briefcase with care and left it on the stone table. It was like the rest of her, unostentatious, exact. "Miss Washington," Thomas said, the syllables a quiet offering. He stepped a little closer, the heel of his boot pressing into the grass. He waited for no flourish, only a permission to be present in a moment that had always felt borrowed. Angela nodded to him. "Thank you," she said softly. Her gratitude was not the dramatic, public kind. It was the private sort that arrives after endurance. Richard had a prepared line about process and precedent. He spoke in the language of postponement. "We can litigate this. We will consult the files. No one should jump to conclusions." But his voice faltered when Ray's phone lit with scanned, notarized pages and signatures. That small screen, held in the detective's palm, had the effect of a window opening where a curtain had formerly hung. Then, as if the day had decided to reveal another layer, Angela unlatched her briefcase again. This time she removed a different item, a narrow black folder heavier than it looked. Its leather had the soft, slightly cracked texture of an object that had been used and respected. On its face a small seal caught the sun. A federal seal, rounded and dignified, the kind one sees more often in courtrooms than at weddings. She laid it on the table like a proposition. For a moment the sound was only the rustle of the linen napkins far down the terrace. Then the seal glittered, and the room noticed. "You don't have to open it," Angela said. Her voice was steady. "But you should know what it is." Victoria's eyes fixed on the folder the way a predator locks on a change in posture. "What is that?" she asked. But the question was rhetorical. It was the kind of question that meant, "Prove it." Detective Ray, who had seen enough badges in his life to recognize shape and ceremony, leaned forward. "May I?" he asked again, this time toward Angela, but also toward the black folder itself. Angela nodded. He opened it with practiced care. Inside lay a document on heavy paper, its typography formal and final, the sort of parchment that announces appointment rather than request. It bore a heading and a name. The lighting that had been soft and forgiving on Victoria's pearls now hit the letterhead and threw it into stark relief. Gasps, some of outright surprise, others of recognition, moved like a ripple. "What is it?" someone whispered. "United States District Court," Ray read, the words like the falling of a gavel in a quiet room. "Commission of appointment." A murmur ran through the assembled guests. It carried the sharp undertone of people who had been confronted by authority they had neither summoned nor expected. The air in the garden shifted. Men in expensive shoes and women in silk rose out of their social posture and, for an instant, took on the stance of those before a judge, uneasy, guilty, or hopeful, depending on what they'd done or not done. Angela's lips barely moved. "I was appointed 3 years ago," she said. She did not elaborate beyond the year. She did not need to. The paper told the rest. It was the kind of credential that, by its presence, asked people to recognize a different hierarchy of truth than the one measured in nameplates and party invitations. Across the lawn, Michael had paused, his hand still at his tux's lapel, uncertain of his proximity to a gathering storm. He watched Ray's face as the detective read, and then he saw the letterhead. Recognition was not immediate. It came like a recollection of a night 3 years earlier that had been full of thunder and mercy. He stepped forward, his step carrying the peculiar mixture of a man who had once been small in a courtroom and had been made larger by a decision that chose potential over punishment. Michael began, and his voice cracked in the most human way. He moved to the microphone left by the bandstand, picking it up like a man who had not intended to speak, but who found himself with a need to say the name out loud. "Everyone," he said, and his voice shot across the lawn. Heads turned, a beat of surprise spread like the opening of a book. Judge Washington, Angela Washington. The words landed with the same physicality as a dropped coin. Some guests looked down at their tables, others leaned in. Victoria's hand flew to her throat, and the pearls at her neck trembled like small alarms. Michael didn't stop. He told the small story in the way that people tell stories that have reshaped their lives, short, limited to the essentials, honest. 3 years ago, I was in a courthouse, he said. Different circumstances. I'd made mistakes. Big ones. I was facing a sentence that would have taken a lot from the people who loved me, from the chances I had. Judge Washington presided. His voice caught. She gave me a choice I didn't expect. Not an easy out, not a getaway. She gave me a sentence that made me accountable and made me better. It was hard. It was fair. It saved me. Silence fell. Not the brittle hush of social duty, but a thoughtful quiet that collects in people's chests when they measure their small lives against another person's mercy. "You told me to go back and learn a trade," Michael continued. "You asked me to do something for others. You let me keep my dignity and made me work for it. If I am standing here today as someone worth celebrating, it is because you saw the person in me instead of just the mistake. You showed mercy, and it changed my life." Around him faces softened. The butler's jaw unclenched. The bridesmaids looked as if they might cry, and a few guests who had judged quietly lowered their eyes. Even Richard Peaton's voice, when he finally spoke, was frayed. He interrupted only to remind, "This is not a criminal proceeding," he said, as if the words would secure the lawn from any subsequent legal tempest. But no one was seeking indignation. They were listening to a man publicly naming the one who had given him a future. Angela's expression did not change in any dramatic way. She had been patient for this moment, but she had not staged it. She met Michael's eyes, and, for a long second, their histories intersected. The woman who had learned to read deeds and to keep the ledger of a family. The man who had once been in a room where a sentence could have ended him. Their connection was not saintly. It was the steady fact of 2 lives that had intersected at a hinge. "You came," Michael said simply, his voice catching. "You came when I asked you to be there." He did not gesture in demand. He did not ask the room to stand. He simply said her name, because names have weight, and in saying it, he gave her what the room had denied. Recognition. Somewhere in the back, a guest with an expensive camera let out a small, shaky laugh, the kind that manages to be both embarrassed and delighted. Phones were raised like votive lights. The photographer who had earlier refused to delete his images put a hand to his mouth. He had been right to keep them. Angela's jaw moved as she took in Michael's words. She reached for the black folder again, and this time the movement carried the definitive air of someone who had accepted a stage and intended to speak usefully, not dramatically. She placed a folded paper on the table and slid it toward Victoria, as if sliding a document across a mediation table. "This does not have to become an ugly legal battle," Angela said, addressing the group but looking directly at Victoria and Richard Peaton. Her voice held the steadiness of someone who had been trained to listen for facts and then act on them. "There are clear records that show long-standing financial involvement by my family. There are surveys, tax records and deeds that need proper review. There is also evidence that suggests irregular transfers were made." She did not say fraud in a tone of indictment. She used the language of obligation. That evidence should be preserved. There should be an independent review. That is what the law demands. Richard's face, usually a mask of control, had gone slightly pallid. He consulted the small law book of his experience: delay, negotiation, settlement. He opened his mouth to argue about process, the comfortable, slow machine of legal defense, but Angela spoke again. "And because this is personal, and because people have worked and lived here for generations, I would prefer that the resolution be restorative rather than merely punitive," she said. "There are ways to rectify errors, to create a fund for the workers who have kept this place, to ensure employment offers for those whose labor has been taken for granted, to establish a scholarship for young people from the community, to do these things in public and with accountability." The crowd listened, the way people listen when a clear set of options is put before them, something punitive, something restorative. Many in the room, confronted by the documentary record and their own conscience, found the restorative terms easier to accept. Angela listed the elements with judicial clarity, not as a litany of commands, but as a blueprint for repair. A public apology to be issued at the estate and in a local paper. A restitution fund, seeded by Bradford Holdings, to be administered by an independent trustee and focused on paying past wages and creating a community endowment for maintenance salaries. Employment offers for estate workers and hiring preferences that would keep Thomas and his family on the payroll. A scholarship to be created in the Washington name for neighborhood students who showed interest in land stewardship and public service. A formal recognition, a plaque near the oak acknowledging the Washington family's historical ties to the land, and a full cooperative handover of digital and paper records to an independent auditor. "She's asking for accountability and repair," Thomas said, his voice small but clear. "Not revenge." The word reverberated in Victoria's ears like a bell. That was not what she had expected. She had rehearsed anger and indignation and the stories that preserve status. She had not prepared for the disarming potency of mercy tied to concrete restoration. Richard pushed back in patterns he knew well. "These are significant demands," he said, "and they imply wrongdoing that must be established before such measures are implemented." Angela met him without a tremor. "They're not demands yet," she answered. "They are conditions I will support if your family chooses to resolve this publicly and cooperatively. If you refuse, the alternative is an independent federal review and the potential for civil and criminal referrals, depending on what is found." That last phrase landed with the weight of consequence. It was not a promise of immediate indictment. Angela had no authority to make such a promise in public, and the law requires procedure, but it was the clear articulation of consequences that follow refusal to cooperate. It was a line drawn between negotiation and recourse. Guests around the lawn shifted. Some murmured assent. Others reached for their phones and dialed quietly. Victoria's face went a complicated grey. Years of cultivated certainty that money and lawyers could contain any narrative now looked fragile in light of documents, and a woman who had both the authority and the moral inclination to use it carefully. "You're suggesting we sign an agreement right now?" Victoria asked, less because she wanted to sign, and more because asking to buy time had been her fallback. She was buying for advice, for leverage, for the small comfort of being able to consult those who had always told her what to do. Angela was not impatient. Her patience was not weakness. It was the kind of waiting that asked for accountability. "I'm suggesting that we begin a process," she said. "We can have council draft an agreement that initiates the independent audit, establishes a temporary fund under joint control, and begins the public apologies and the hiring commitments. The records will be preserved. The parties will cooperate. If those steps are rejected, I will refer the material to the proper federal authorities for review." The lawyer inside Richard saw options. Settlement would be costly, but predictable. Exposure would be unpredictable and potentially ruinous. He glanced at Victoria and told her in a voice that was both intimate and clinical, "You need to decide quickly whether this is something you want to control through negotiation or whether you want to risk protracted litigation." Victoria's eyes darted around the guests like a woman searching for an ally. The allies were sparse. Some of her old supporters had already taken themselves aside to make private calls. The bridesmaids clustered in whispers about decor and the discomfort of watching an estate's origin story be rewritten under their champagne flutes. The band, obligingly sensing a change in tempo, lowered a cello note into the background like a tension string. The harpist's hands trembled on a chord that refused to finish. Michael's voice cut in, unexpectedly firm. "If it helps, I'll help with the scholarship," he said. "I don't want this to be a battle. He struggled for the right word. "I want the people who kept this place to be recognized. If I can help make that happen, I will." The offer was small and human, and it changed the tone of the discussion. It put the groom on the side of reconciliation, not against it. It turned the spectacle into a potential repair. Angela looked at Michael, then at Victoria. "This is not about humiliation," she said. "It's about truth and responsibility. You built your life here. That is not a crime in itself. But if that life rests on misfiled deeds and missing acknowledgments, there is a moral obligation to fix it." Richard sighed, the sound of a man who calculates costs. He turned to his phone, already composing an email to partners who could draft the beginnings of an agreement. "We'll need specifics," he said. "We'll need time to pull legal counsel." "You have a week," Angela said, and the rhythm of her voice made the timeline feel reasonable. "A week to propose a public plan that includes the items I mentioned. If you are unwilling, I will not hesitate to refer this to the proper investigative offices." A low murmur of assent went around the guests. Some nodded, relieved that an off-ramp existed that did not involve handcuffs or headlines. Others, those who had not wanted to be dragged into the moral center of a story, edged away toward the cake table, careful to avoid eye contact. Victoria's posture changed. She folded in on herself like a flower losing water. She thought, privately and terribly, of reputations, of foundations and board seats, of charitable dinners where appearances were carefully curated. What she had not accounted for was the stubbornness of paperwork and the human consequence of ignoring a family's labor. In the middle of this, Thomas stepped forward. People made a little room for him, as they do for elders who carry witness. He spoke in a voice roughened by years of work, but clear with the authority of lived memory. "My father planted those oaks," he said. "The Washingtons lived here. They kept records. When things were changed, we were told to keep quiet or we'd lose our jobs. I don't want anyone punished. I want what's fair. I want respect." There was no theatricality in his plea. It was the plain, steady voice of someone asking to be seen. Angela's eyes softened with something like recognition and sorrow. "You will be recognized," she promised, "and I will make sure the record is clear. Not because I want to humiliate anyone, but because history should be true." The negotiation that followed was not done in a single breath. Lawyers moved with the methodical speed of professionals. Drafts were mentioned, clauses outlined. But something else had happened on that lawn. The public's willingness to accept the convenient myth of ownership had been punctured by paper and personal testimony. Victoria, pressed, made a calculated decision. She would accept a mediated public process. She signed, with Richard's guidance, to begin an independent audit and to establish an interim trust to seed payback for the labourers while the records were reviewed. It was a small, practical exceeding, an act chosen from practicality rather than remorse. But in the soft light of the afternoon, it felt like a public step toward making amends. Richard negotiated the language like a man bargaining for his client's dignity. He insisted that no admission of guilt be written into the initial statements. He wanted words that allowed his client to bow gracefully. Angela, who had spent years listening to both sides of arguments in her chambers, allowed for that. A restorative process could be built with careful legal scaffolding. Her interest was not in public shaming, but in institutional repair and the dignity of the people who had been erased. When the basic framework was sketched, an independent auditor to be appointed, funds to be placed in escrow, a public apology to be issued, and immediate steps to rehire and compensate certain long-standing workers, applause broke from a few corners of the lawn. It was not the wild applause of a theatre, but the relieved, honest sound of people who had been given an ethical option. Victoria signed the initial acknowledgement with a hand that trembled visibly. She added the flattest of apologies into the text. It was careful and management-friendly, but it existed. The social media phones began to buzz. Within minutes, the brief story of the morning was moving through feeds. The video of Michael naming Judge Washington, the reveal of county records, the sight of Victoria's cursive being pressed to paper. Detective Ray, for his part, kept his professional distance. He had seen the beginning of a possible investigative path, and he had seen the practical path Angela was offering. He would, as always, document and advise, but he also saw the value in a constructive resolution. The law had tools for punishment and tools for repair. Sometimes the latter served justice better in the long arc. Over the next hour, the wedding resumed with a different character. Conversations were softer, and some people used their phones to send messages of apology to names they had previously avoided. Servers moved with renewed purpose, some of them exchanging glances with Thomas and others who had stood at the edges of the story. The photographer, who had earlier been asked to delete images, now walked the lawn with the same camera but with a new reverence. He quietly took shots that he knew would matter. Michael, having spoken, returned to his place and took Angela's hand for a heartbeat in thanks. There was a recognition in that touch that did not invite more than the moment. Dances resumed with a hesitance that eventually melted into music. The ceremony that had been planned, flowers, speeches, cake, happened, but with a new undercurrent. A wedding that had been interrupted by truth had rearranged its priorities. It left room at the edge of the celebration for repair. Before she stepped away from the patio, Angela turned to the assembled staff and to Thomas. She spoke again, quietly, to the people who had witnessed, who had seen memory and toil. "This is not about erasing anyone," she said. "It's about recognizing what was done and making sure those who kept this place are honored and cared for." Thomas's eyes gleamed with something close to relief. "Thank you, Miss Angela," he said. "There were no grand gestures. They did what people do when long-deferred acknowledgement arrives. They accepted it and let their faces show the easing of a heavy muscle." Victoria retreated into a small group with Richard and a few close friends. The guests resumed their small pleasures, but there was a new tone to the toasts. Gravity married to celebration. Michael, in his speech later, spoke to the complexity of family and history and to the honor of making things right. He thanked Angela again in front of everyone, and in that public naming he gave her the recognition she had been initially denied. When evening folded over the estate and bulbs flickered on, Angela gathered her briefcase. The black folder with the federal seal she closed with a deliberate movement and slid back into its leather guard. She had used neither drama nor malice. She had used documents, testimony, and a quietly authoritative insistence on truth. Before she left the patio, she lingered at the oak tree. The brass plate under its branches glinted in the lower light, now less arrogant and oddly vulnerable. She ran her fingertips across the plate, across the raised letters. The action was a private ceremony, the touch of someone who had held this land in memory and now in public record. A few guests approached, not the ones who had mocked her earlier, but those who had been thoughtful, those who had chosen curiosity over reflex. They offered handshakes that felt like reparations in miniature. A woman who'd earlier suggested there were children around met Angela's gaze and apologized, sincere and tearful. Angela accepted with the same quiet dignity she always carried. At the edge of the lawn, Detective Ray folded his jacket collar against a gentle evening breeze. He caught Angela's eye. "You handled that well," he said. It was a simple assessment from a man who had seen how easily proceedings and people unspooled. "We did what needed doing," Angela replied. Her voice was low and warm, with the fatigue that follows long restraint. Ray's professional instincts still hummed beneath his words. "You'll want to formalize the documentation and ensure the audit has independent oversight," he said. "I'll help where I can." Angela smiled a small, private smile. "I appreciate that," she said. And she hesitated, looking at the estate that had held generations. "I think the first repair is not in courts, but in how we name people who have kept a place for others. The rest will follow." She walked to the gravel drive where a car waited, its chrome catching the evening light. Thomas watched her go with the solemnity of a witness. The wedding continued behind her in a quieter key. Couples danced under new stars, and a man in a tux danced in a way that hinted at gratitude rather than oblivion. In the days that followed, the estate became the subject of local reporting, not scandal sheets, but measured pieces about property records and restorative agreements. A trustee was appointed to manage the initial funds. A public apology was printed and read aloud at a repair ceremony beside the oak. The scholarship was established, an awkward, wonderful committee of old money and new accountability, and its first recipient was a local student who wanted to study land stewardship, the type of ambition that seemed to stitch the past to the future. Victoria's name stayed in the social columns, but it carried a different tone. She avoided cameras for a while, as people who are forced to reckon often do. Richard Peaton quietly advised her through the negotiations that would follow. Civil suits and possible criminal reviews might take months to sort. The law is not fast, and that was part of the point. Accountability unfolds slowly, with hearings and evidence and impartial review. Angela had not promised an immediate fall. She had insisted upon a process that would either heal or expose. The path chosen by Victoria's family, cooperation, meant that healing would be the likely outcome. Had they refused, the consequence could have been slow, messy litigation and a public investigation. Michael continued his life with a different kind of attention. He used the scholarship fund at the weddings, charity events. He spoke of Thomas and the workers as family. He did not make grand pronouncements about having been redeemed. He let his actions, quiet and consistent, be the testimony to the mercy that had been shown to him. Angela returned to courtrooms and to evenings in her chambers, where she read petitions and listened to plea arguments. Her life did not spin on headlines. It moved by paperwork and judgment, and the small, steady insistence that the truth be found, and that justice be administered with mercy. Once late at night, she sat at her kitchen table and took from a drawer a small, dog-eared photograph of her father standing on a stretch of land. He wore work clothes and a hat, and the look of someone who had tended soil and faith in equal measure. She pressed the paper to her lips briefly, not as an invocation, but as memory. He had taught her how to keep records and how to be patient with the law and with people. Those lessons had guided her in a garden where power could be used to crush or to repair. Power, she had learned, was a test. It asked whether those who had it would fold it over others or use it to lift people who had been ignored. The measures she proposed at the wedding were not punitive theatre. They were scaffolding for a community to rebuild. In the months that followed, the plaque near the oak was installed with simple reverence. It did not erase the brass plate that still hung with its old name, but it sat beside it, a correction in metal and words. People read both plates and felt that the estate had grown honest. Thomas's family ate better. Employees received back pay that had been audited and restored to accounts. The scholarship opened doors to young people who would, in the years to come, learn stewardship, law, and civic care. There were those who said Angela had been dramatic, that a federal judge ought not to appear at a wedding to direct social policy. They missed the point. She had not used her station to punish. She had used evidence and the authority of documentation to create a path toward truth. People who had been powerful found that power tempered by the public gaze and an insistence on repair could be redemptive instead of destructive. On an ordinary day in court, in a room where cases rise and settle like tides, Angela sometimes thought about that afternoon. She thought about the oak and the brass plate and Thomas's steady voice. She thought about Michael, who had been willing to name her in front of a crowd. She thought about the photographer who had chosen to preserve the images, to hold a record when asked to erase it. Small acts of courage, she had observed, compound over time. At the end of a long week, she drafted a letter to the community that had gathered that day. Not a legal brief, but a plain note on civic duty. She spoke of the importance of records and memory, of acknowledging labor, and of choosing restitution where repair was possible. She did not preach. She asked questions. She asked quietly who among us would use influence to elevate and repair, and who would use it to deny and diminish. That question, later published in a small op-ed and in the speech notes of the repair ceremony, found its way to many conversations. It was the kind of question that did not demand a correct answer so much as prompt one. People debated it politely and fiercely in living rooms and at dinner tables. A year after the wedding, on a warm afternoon when the oak tree's shadow spread in cautious benediction, the estate hosted a small ceremony. The plaque beside the brass plate bore the Washington name and a few dignified words about memory and stewardship. Thomas stood beside his grandson and smiled in a way that had nothing performative in it, just relief and a sense of restoration. Angela attended but did not take the stage. She watched from the back, and then, when the crowd thinned, she walked across the lawn. Michael found her and touched her arm briefly, the way people touch those who have carried them through storms. "Thank you again," he said, but his gratitude was not for a single day. It was for a life redirected by mercy that had been given, and for the public way that honor had been restored. Angela nodded. "Do the work," she said simply. "Keep tending it." She left the estate that day without ceremony. There was no need. The work she had set in motion, an audit, a fund, a scholarship, steady hires, was not about a single woman's vanity. It was about a community learning to name people and to correct old erasures. On her way out, a young intern at her chambers who'd been born in the town came up to her. He had read the op-ed and had watched the small ceremonies. He looked at her with the hopeful intensity of someone beginning a career. "How do you decide when to use your power?" he asked, earnest as a freshman. She considered him a moment as the afternoon sun warmed the courthouse steps. "I ask whether the outcome will elevate somebody who has been ignored, or whether it will only tear someone down," she said. "If it elevates, then I use the power. If it merely tears down, I find another way." He nodded as if a new map had been laid before him. "Would you say that's mercy?" he asked. "It's mercy with accountability," she answered. "Mercy without correction risks repeating the wrong. Correction without mercy becomes cruelty. Both are necessary." As he walked away, scribbling the words, she thought of the ledger her father had taught her to keep. It was a long document, pages of history, margins filled with notes. She believed that the public record is a moral instrument when used faithfully. That afternoon at the wedding had been one instance where a small set of facts redirected a social equation. It was not a universal cure, but it was a way forward. On quiet nights, when she read petitions and listened to remorse and hope in the same breath, she thought of the guests who had avoided her at the driveway. She thought of the brass plate and the way the light had once bounced off it with arrogant assurance. She thought of Michael saying her name at the microphone and how that naming had done the simple work of recognition. In the end, what stayed with her was not the theatrical reveal of a black folder or the inconvenient glare of county records. It was the small, sustained work of repair. The scholars who walked through the scholarship doors, the workers whose paychecks increased, the plaque that named an erased family, and the people in that crowd who learned to look twice before they send someone away. She carried none of it like a trophy. She carried it like the slow, patient work that a life of public service requires: clear papers, steady testimony, a willingness to speak truth and then to build bridges. The power of the judge is not only the ability to punish, it is the ability to direct attention to what needs mending, to marshal systems so people can be seen, and then to step back so the community can do its part. And so the question remained, not as a sermon but as an invitation. When you have power, however small or great, will you use it to elevate or to tear down? What would you choose? Would you lift someone into dignity, or would you use your advantage to diminish? Tell us in the comments, would you use power to elevate or to humiliate?